Hello and welcome. I decided that I needed a different intro or something, so I'm dancing to the imaginary music in my head because I feel like I say the same things over and over again. And if I were a student, I would be tuning me out. So, hi. I know I'm a little punchy. It's been a long day, but here I am setting up the next lecture for this week. So, are we ready to get into it? Today we're going to talk about chapter 6 because we got 5 and 6 this week, and we have a lot of stuff that we're talking about. I hope you're using the book, and I didn't go into the discussion forums yet, but that's my plan to do next and see what everyone is up to and saying. Get real creative. I want to hear your thoughts. Just so you know too, I mean, I fully recognize there's a reason why people are always debating this stuff and why it gets so politically fueled. It's because the answers are not easy. If anyone has spent any time on social media in the last week, you probably have seen some debating about the tuition forgiveness kind of program and that anticipated. And it's very polarizing. Some people feel very strongly and some people feel very strongly the other way. So this kind of stuff really does get people amped up, and working in this field can do that to you. You will have, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is that you will have your own feelings and opinions about things, but you still have to be neutral with your clients and not let that sway the decisions that you make as a professional. So let me open my PowerPoint because that's where we're going to start today. I am going to truly blow through the slides because I don't want to spend all day doing this, and neither do you. I try to keep, I usually try to keep my lessons to about 30 to 40 minutes. And I realized that with the slides, it tends to be a little bit longer, and I'm trying to get away from that. But like I said, this has been tricky with this class because there's so much information. And so many of you have said to me, I don't even really know what social work is. So I want to give you the kind of the bigger picture so that you do know. So some of the stuff, it doesn't mean that it's not important. It just means that I'm not going to focus on it for the purposes of our discussion. And I'm going to leave it to you to review these slides for the details and all that other stuff. Now, one other thing too, like I said, I post these in the LMS so you can open these. If you open the slides, you'll also see all of the notes. Like if you open it in PowerPoint itself and you look at the slides, you'll also see the notes associated with the slides. So there's more detail there. There's a lot of explanation if you go back and review it later, just for those of you who want to. And a quick note about notes. A few of you emailed me about notes. How many notes should I be taking? What kind of notes should I be taking? And my answer to that is whatever works for you and helps you learn. I know that's kind of a vague answer, but some people really work better when they write a lot of stuff down, and other people do better when they pay attention and listen and then just jot down words or highlight passages or something like that. So whatever works for you works for me. If you want to print out my PowerPoints and jot like bullet points next to it, you can do that. If you take digital notes, you can do that. If you are taking handwritten notes, literally whatever works for you, I want you to be learning. So if I know that the notes are really just to kind of show me that you're participating and that you're actively listening and not just kind of speeding through and whatever, but actually digesting stuff. So as long as you're writing some stuff down and I can see the progress that you're learning, some thoughts, that's fine with me. All right, so now we're on to chapter 6, family and child welfare. We're going to be talking a lot about the domestic relationships and, you know, a lot of this is where the foster care stuff comes into play. So there's a lot of stuff in these first couple slides that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but it sort of talks about, and does in the chapter as well, talks about how, you know, families have become very diverse over time. If you think about how things were depicted or how things actually were in, say, the 1950s, where the the nuclear family was the mom and the dad and the 2 kids and the dog, possibly a cat too. And dad would work all day and mom stayed at home and she cooked pot roast, and it was all very nuclear family. And that was considered like the perfect, but things have really evolved. And I'm not saying that's even good or bad. It just, that's the reality, is that we're seeing less and less of that. And the definitions and people's expectations of what a family looks like has truly, I don't think there is a definition to it anymore. So, I mean, really a family is just a social unit where people form relationships, commitment to live together as a defined family group, and it may be based on kinship. So we're seeing a lot more of people that are, committed together as a family, but not in the traditional sense. It may include extended families. It may include people that are no blood relation, but, we have families that are transgender, LGBTQ. We have people that have divorced and then remarried. I actually fall into that group. I had in fully admitting, without airing all my dirty laundry, but this impacts me as I'm even teaching this, because I was in an abusive marriage and got divorced. And so I wanted my kids to be safe, got out of that situation. He was abusive to them as well. And after a lot of stuff in between, I did end up getting remarried last year. My husband is wonderful. My kids have a new stepdad. I have 2 new, I don't even say stepdaughters. I say my 2 bonus daughters, because that's what they are. I didn't give birth to them, but they are my daughters nonetheless. So, and we really truly do function. We are a family. So, and I don't guess not the traditional definition, but here we are nonetheless. So due to a whole bunch of different things, today's family is diverse. It looks different. Again, I keep saying the phrase, it's like check your assumptions at the door, because that's really truly what this work is all about, is not assuming, but really gathering the facts as to how people live and what their, who is their support system, who do they love, who are they with, and who is their family, however you choose to label that. Divorce, the stigma has been decreasing. I can say that even from personal experience. I think that, in the 1950s, for example, if people got divorced, there was a certain level of stigma attached to it, that it was quite the talk of the town if you got divorced or something like that. But there's a lot of reasons for divorce. One that I just cited, but people get divorced for a bunch of reasons. And it's not necessarily a negative thing. I can say from my own personal experience, I think getting divorced was probably one of the best things I could have done for my children, because now we're in a good home, we're in a good place, we're in a good relationship. Our home life is harmonious. There's no fighting, there's no violence, there's no bad stuff. So I look at it as like a good thing that I did. It was difficult to go through. And as you know, divorce rates they're still holding steady. I believe the divorce rate is still about 50%, which is pretty intense. So more than likely, you're going to have clients that fall into some of these categories. Separation may or may not lead to divorce. Sometimes people just need space from one another. And if someone is separated, even if it's so informally separated, meaning they just, they are no longer living together, but they're still legally married. There's a separation where you just physically separate from each other for a bit. There's also what's called a legal separation, where you can actually go through the court and basically assert that you're separated and that there's ground rules for the separation, and they may or may not end up getting divorced. So these are important too, because you need to know legally where people are in the process, especially if you're going to be working with kids. You need to know what mom and dad's status is. Are they legally married? Who has rights? Who doesn't? Is there something in the courts? You need to be aware of whatever their situation is, because that's going to be how you're going to be able to try and figure out how to help them. And I'm going to skip over this one again. It talks a lot about the demographics of, like, you know, obviously there's going to be a lot of single moms. There's going to be primarily, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of that listed in the book, talking about people's opinions about being together, how people's opinions on relationships and marriage have changed, whether or not couples should stay together or should they cohabitate and live together without being married, et cetera, et cetera. This is important too, because we were talking about values and things like that. If you have very strong values that there should be a nuclear family, that's fabulous, but also understand that that may not be your client's definition of what a family is, and they may not want to get married. That may not be their plan or their values. So that may challenge, a little bit. Domestic violence is obviously going to be a big part of the conversation. You're going to be dealing with a lot of children that may have been in households. And obviously a lot of children, especially if you're working in the foster care system, they're removed from their households for a reason. They're in foster care for a reason. There aren't going to be any children that you're going to be working with in foster care that are coming from happy beginnings. There's going to be trauma. There's going to be stuff that you have to help work through and understand. So right now, IPV, as they're showing it in the slides, is called intimate partner violence. And that's basically how they address domestic violence situations. They're calling it IPV because it can be between any two people in a domestic relationship. Can also, as I just mentioned, like I said, you have kids that are coming from all kinds of backgrounds and issues. There's going to be children that have been mistreated, neglected, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and maltreatment. And it can be very, very difficult, but it's really important to understand where these kids are coming from. Ultimately, working as a social worker, if you're working anywhere in the foster care system, your first and foremost goal is going to make sure that the well-being and safety of the child is protected. So evaluating the situation that they're in, is it okay for them to stay there? Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes they just need resources in the home. Maybe mom or dad need support or resources in the home, and the children don't necessarily need to come out. Sometimes they have been in foster care and they're being reunited with their parents and they need support in order to do that. And other times mom and dad may be in crisis and the children need to come out of the home and into foster care so that they can be protected while mom and dad get what they need. And with the hope of reunification, that is always the goal, if it can be done safely. You, as a social worker, or whoever the social worker is specifically trained, and you're going to get a lot more training than what this class offers, will be to really know how to look for signs of abuse and neglect. It is not always very obvious. I've been doing this for a long time, and I believe this is in a slide that's coming up, but even if you're not a social worker, if you work somewhere in the field, you are what is called a mandated reporter. And I have been for years because of the work that I do. Meaning, even if I'm not a social worker, if a client, let's say your client, you're the social worker, but they also came to see me in a voc rehab capacity, and I noticed signs that were red flags to me that I thought that they were unsafe. I, as a mandated reporter, would have to report that to the authorities and make sure that they were safe. So you get very good at knowing what some of those things are. There's certain patterns of behavior that a lot of children will do. as well as sometimes tell you outright what's going on. And sometimes kids don't know that something is not normal because they've lived it, and so it becomes their normal. So they may say something very offhand or very casually to you that you're like, whoa, that's not okay. But the kids don't realize that it's not okay because it's always been that way. So, you know, they might say very casually about daddy hitting them with the switch. Or they might very casually say something about an uncle that touched them inappropriately. You know, I mean, they might just blurt something out, not realizing that it's a very big problem. And there's also consequences to that too, because then you have an obligation to report something, and sometimes it can very much open up a can of worms. And then the child feels like they started a big problem, or they caused a problem, or they get very fearful that mommy or daddy might get very angry because they said something they shouldn't. So again, these are not things that you need to specifically worry about in this class. But again, as we talk about what the field looks like, what kinds of work social workers do, these are the kinds of very difficult conversations and things that I was mentioning before that you generally would be doing if you were right in the thick of doing this work. Now, some of the other things, children that are in these situations are very susceptible to other types of abuse, trauma, things like child trafficking. And so there's a whole section in the book too that also talks about that and other things that children are susceptible to. Now, there's two different types of welfare agencies, public and private. The public ones are funded by tax revenue and pay higher salaries. I'm not exactly sure what they mean by that. Says often includes services such as adoption, family life education, child protective services, in-home family-centered intervention, and residential services. This is what you generally, you know, child protective services or whatever it's called in your state. In my state, it's called DCYF. There's different acronyms in different states, but basically it's the child welfare agency, and they do everything from like the home visits to, now these social workers that have these caseloads, they usually have very big caseloads. They are very overworked. It can be very frustrating because there's just not enough people for the work to go around. And it's really hard to keep tabs on all of your families and everything with the workloads as large as they are. There's also a little bit in the book about the development of child welfare services. So it was in the 1800s that the first child welfare institutions came about. And then in the 1900s, child abuse became criminal. Now, it seems like a long time ago, which it kind of is, but if you think about it, it took until the 1900s for someone to say, you really shouldn't beat your kid. That surprises me a little bit. And sometimes some of these things in history make me go, 1960s, which again, in the scheme of history is not that long ago, that battered child syndrome was identified as an actual thing, shaken baby syndrome, and then abuse became mandated reporting. So again, as I was talking about being a mandated reporter, these are the kind of things like a child goes to school and has bruises, or a child goes to school and, you know, they always have tattered clothing, or they never have a lunch, or things like that. Those are things that a teacher learns to identify and let, and they have an obligation, even if the child says, my mommy's going to be so mad, like you can't tell anybody. The teacher has to, by law, if they think that something is going on, or the child tells them that something is going on, they have to. So what exactly is considered within a parent's rights? Well, parents do have a pretty wide allowance to discipline their children. However, there is a very specific definition of abuse that's kind of out there. It has gotten narrower, and I think a lot of people consider things abuse that they did not consider abuse however many years ago. The best interest of the families may conflict with the children, and there's sometimes a lot of back and forth between child welfare agencies versus the family service agencies. Let's see. Global context for child protection, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are cultures conceive of childhood. Yes, there are some cultural things that I think that if you work in this field, that is important to know and be mindful of, that people from different cultural backgrounds have different views and values on the family and what is acceptable in raising a child. And it may be different than what you've seen before. So again, take the time to really understand the family and what they view and what they believe, because you need to be able to operate within their parameters. So this just lists out some of the key services that are available, which we've already kind of talked about, and the book goes into a lot more detail. Child protective services, family-based services, family preservation services, and family foster care. Now, obviously, child protective services jumps in and handles children that may be in immediate or imminent danger and need to be removed from the home. Family-based services provide supports and services for a whole bunch of things for families, depending on what their needs may be. Family preservation services might be in those situations that could become a foster care situation, but they're able to implement supports and services in the home so that the kids can stay there safely. And then, of course, there's family foster care, where the children are placed in a safe home for a period of time while the family receives support services. And these all can work together. It's not like someone has to just choose one. The social worker generally will recommend services for. So the social worker is kind of the hub of the whole thing, and will sit down with the family or talk to the family, evaluate the situation, and make a recommendation as to what resources and services are needed to be implemented right now. And it could involve one of these, or it could involve all four, or even other agencies. And so the social worker is kind of like the ringleader that pulls all of the information together and creates a plan and says, okay, you in Child Protective Services, I need you to make sure these kids are safe. Please go to the home and do an evaluation. And then they submit a request to that office for them to do their part of the job. Family-based services would receive a message from the social worker, and then they would do their part of the job. And everyone hopefully will work together to get this family where they need to be. And again, I talked a little bit about these. Family reunification services. The goal is always to try and keep the family unit together, if at all possible, as long as it is safe. Adoption services, if the child cannot be reunified with their family, or their parents are deceased or incarcerated, situations like that, then they will move to for the children to be adopted and find good, safe homes. Residential care, independent living services, and intensive treatment. So they can offer all of these things for individuals who may need additional supports. Things like residential care and independent living services might be for children who have special needs and have a disability, and they might not be able to care for themselves even after they're of adult age. Residential care and independent living services might come in to be able to help that person be able to live as independently as possible, even if their parents are not able to take care of them for whatever reason. Just some more information about, I'm reading the notes again. Gaps in service continue to exist, and some agencies are vastly overburdened with cases they lack the workforce to adequately manage. Yep. Life-threatening struggles of families and children migrating from Central America, attempting to seek safety and sanctuary in the United States, continues to be a big problem, and obviously also adds to some of the work that these agencies do. So these are two other terms that are important for you to know. So the way that the book describes these is institutional/primary view is that humans generally try to succeed, but may struggle to do so in the face of challenges and negative factors outside their control. Communities should help whenever possible. And then there's the residual or secondary view, which states that people are responsible for their own situation and should escape problematic circumstances through their own efforts without government intervention whenever possible. So this is basically putting a name to some of the attitudes that we were talking about in the last one. Whereas there are some people that believe that, you know, the government has a role in helping people to get on their feet and provide sources and resources. And then there's other groups of people that are like, hey, you made your bed, you lie in it, and then, you know, you should pick yourself up by your bootstraps and figure out how to get out of your situation. This goes back to when we were talking about the poverty stuff. Social workers' attitudes towards child and family services. Services help children move towards positive lives. Diversity factors contribute to risk and right to self-determination. Absolutely. Again, the goal is your social workers are in a helper capacity, and we want to provide resources, we want to provide guidance, and sometimes we have to do a lot of it. But ultimately, the goal is self-determination. We want people to be independent and to be able to do these things on their own. So it's kind of, you ever heard of that old adage, you know, give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach a man to fish and he's got, you know, he can do it forever. So this is kind of the same thing where we're really teaching self-determination. We want to put people in a better situation so that they can advocate for themselves, get their needs met, and live independently without needing constant intervention from these programs. Sometimes that's not always possible. There's a whole section that talks about specifically social work in schools. I know a lot of you will be working in education, so I really do want you to read that part of the book. It's really interesting, actually. How social work, they finally, again, in the 1900s, apparently a lot of people, the brain cells were going off in the 1900s. They were like, hey, we should stop beating kids. And two, we should get some social work in the schools. So they did these two things in the early 1900s. So good for them. Sorry for I have to be sarcastic sometimes with this stuff because it's like, really? So emerged in the early 1900s where they realized that having a social work presence really helped with the community because it provided support to the students, the parents, the teachers, the administration, and the community as a whole, because a social worker, and you'll see that there's a social worker just about in every school, that they know how to communicate with the kids. They know how, when those red flags are going up. And whilst teachers, yes, they are trained to notice some things, a social worker is going to be much more finely tuned in to those kinds of things. And the teacher can call the social worker in and say, I think I might be seeing something that's wrong, but I really could use your expert opinion on, you know, what's going on with this kid. You know, he comes in every day, he's got his head down, he doesn't really want to talk to anyone. He's been wearing the same shirt for 4 days in a row. He doesn't have any lunch money. Like, there could be a lot of things going on. And a social worker is trained to be able to reach out to that student, talk to them privately, and figure out what's going on. It could be a problem at home. It could be a problem at school. Maybe the kid's getting bullied. So the social worker needs to be dialed into all the possibilities and kind of problem solve and figure out what's going on and be able to determine how serious the problem actually is. So, and I seem to be skipping ahead. Every time I say something, the next slide says something that I said, and I'm not planning that. I'm not planning it. So violence and bullying, some of the challenges that are facing school social workers. It is really hard to address bullying because even when you know when it exists, you can't always stop it. Sometimes kids don't want to talk about it. They face further bullying if they talk about it to the school social worker. So the social worker has a very difficult job in trying to figure out how to connect with that student and help them in a way that's actually going to be helpful, instead of that student leaves and then the bully sees that the student was talking to the school social worker and then gets beat on the way home because they ratted out the bully or whatever. I mean, it happens every day. We have students that are dealing with poverty. Like I said, they're coming in with no lunch, the same clothes, they don't have shoes. I mean, I could tell you stories. It sounds ridiculous. Like, how do they go to school with no shoes? It happens. Students that are experiencing homelessness. There are several students that we're aware of that, you know, are sleeping in their cars. They live with their parents and they're sleeping in their cars. If we're aware of that, depending on, more often than not, these are situations where if you know that a student is living with their parents out of the car, they will probably be removed from the parents because that's not safe. And they would end up going into foster care at that point. Physical and mental challenges. There are kids that are dealing with anxiety. They have all kinds of different mental health illnesses. They may be diagnosed, they might not be diagnosed. And so sometimes the school social worker is the first person that actually, sometimes the parents are very overwhelmed and they don't even know what's going on with their child. And the school social worker is sometimes the first one to say, hey, there's something going on here, and pull the parents in to say, how can I help you? Because it seems like your child needs help and needs resources. And then lastly, teen pregnancy. Obviously, still a lot of education that needs to be done. The social worker is obviously there to provide consultation and guidance for students that may need it. Funding can be equalized across districts much more than it is. And many people cannot afford to live in quality school districts. So you will find that there's a huge difference between districts and what they offer. I work with schools that provide all of their students with textbooks and brand new Chromebooks. I also work with schools who can't even afford to give their kids pencils and the teachers have to buy them. So it's really across the board. And those kids that are already struggling in poverty, guess what? School is too. And that's makes it even more difficult. Obviously, we've already talked about gender, diversity, sexual orientation, all of that kind of thing. Ethnicity plays a huge role in a lot of this. Ooh, where did I go? Okay. So like I said, you can see in the bottom here, when you open up in PowerPoint, you'll see like all of my notes down here that relate to that slide. So just take a look at those two. I think that will be helpful to you. Hold on, let me stop sharing. All right. I feel like I was talking so fast just to get through it, so I don't keep everyone for like an hour and a half. Okay, so that second lecture, we've talked about chapter 6. If you have any questions, feel free to post those, email them to me, whatever you want to do. I'm going to be jumping in over the next couple of days and I'll be posting some questions and responses to the discussion posts and hopefully answering some questions. So don't just post your ideas. If you have questions and there's stuff that we're doing that you're really just not understanding, by all means, tell me what they are and we can go over it. I can try to explain it or give some scenarios. We can do a, walk through it that way, whatever works. So keep me posted. Thank you everyone for your work so far. Looks like everyone is getting caught up, or if you're not caught up already. And if you're not, please let me know. And I want to tweak too. So I don't want anyone to fall behind any further if you believe that you are. So don't hesitate to email me. All right. Have a great week. I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.